Hello, friends. Today I am joined by Karen Glass. Karen, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Amy.
Well, Karen has been homeschooling her children for 25 years, and she's not quite finished yet. She's one of the founders of Ambleside Online Curriculum Project and has delved deeply into Charlotte Mason's philosophy of education. She's been reading and studying about classical education since 1998. She has lived in Poland, where her husband ministers, for over 20 years. And in the last few years, she has begun writing books to share some of the things she's learned along the way. I actually read my first one of your books earlier this year, and it was just a delight. So,
Well,
if you
thank
could start just by telling us a little bit about your family and how you came to homeschooling.
All right. Well, I have 4 children. And when my husband and I got married, we were already making plans to be involved in overseas ministry. So it was the default that would homeschool. Now, this is kind of amusing, but my husband worked for several years for Abeka Video. I mean, this is in the days when we were talking about real, actual VHS videos. He was in charge of copying them and shipping them out to people using Rebecca Video School. So we just assumed, hey, well, this is how we'll homeschool with Rebecca videos. It just, I mean, obviously today to hear that sounds absolutely hilarious because I would never, ever, ever use Rebecca Video School. But that's what we thought. And then, so my children were quite young, not anywhere near school age, when I went to my first homeschool convention where we were living, and I had a 3-year-old and a 9-month-old. And so, like I said, I was planning to homeschool and I was planning to use Rebecca Video, but I went to this homeschool convention just to see what it was all about. And while I was there, I've always loved to read. And so I was just drawn to the corner with the guy who had all the books, like the real books, not just textbooks. And while I was browsing over there, he handed me a copy of For the Children's Sake and said, "You need to read this." He's looking at my little kids, I was thinking, you're not ready to homeschool. And so I read that, and it did a complete turnaround in my mind about education and what it was and how it should be. And I ordered the 6-volume set of Charlotte Mason, and I just never looked back. So the decision to homeschool was basically because we were planning to live outside the country. And then the decision to homeschool with Charlotte Mason style was just kind of a God thing because we had other plans at one time.
Yes, the providence of getting to discover that approach to education before you had started. So you kind of got to work
Right.
your way in there. So I'm a second generation homeschooler, and we would always go to the homeschool conventions. And those were always my favorite booths too, the ones that would just like take up the whole corner of, the convention center, and they'd be filled with old and used books. And I could spend hours in there.
So I have 4 children. 3 of them are graduated, and I still have one high schooler still at home. And they've all been educated 100% from start to finish with Charlotte Mason education.
Well, having had that same kind of philosophy and those principles, would you say that there have still been ways in which your homeschool or your approach to sort of education has grown and developed over the years?
Oh, absolutely. This may sound funny. Everybody has kind of had the benefit of hearing and learning about Charlotte Mason from so many different sources. But when I was first starting out, those volumes, those 6 pink Charlotte Mason volumes, had only been republished in 1989, and I think I got my set in 1993 or 1994. And that is the absolute beginning of what we call the internet. It really wasn't the internet then, but you could be online with a modem, and there were ways to get in touch with other people, and it was just extremely, extremely new. So I went looking for other homeschoolers, in that venue, and I found some people who wanted to read, and we started reading those books together, and they were just so hard. And there was nobody to tell us that you didn't need to start with one and read straight through. Like, you know, there was nobody to tell us that. If there was anybody who'd read all six, I would be very surprised at that stage of the game. So it took us years to read through them all. And you honestly can't read a volume of Charlotte Mason and truly grasp it, even on a single reading. You have to read it multiple times. It's just so dense. She's such a dense writer. And so with multiple readings, you know, gradually we learn more and more things. And so I've refined my understanding of Charlotte Mason many times over the years as I've learned more. I'm trying to think of something specific. Well, Charlotte Mason always talks about children reading books in a slow way, like, you know, across a term, you know, she assigns a chapter a week. And in my earliest years of homeschooling, we used Sunlight for several years, and Sunlight schedules books a chapter a day. So you get through a book in about 2 weeks, and then you move on to another one. And I've always been a voracious reader myself. And so I read that about, you know, the slow reading and taking a whole, you know, 12 weeks to read through one book. And it just seemed, I don't know, it didn't seem like a good idea. I couldn't see any point to it. But when my son, my oldest child, was about 10, I experimented. And I gave him, I had 2 books that were similar in length, similar in difficulty. And I gave him one to read the Sunlight way. So he read a chapter a day and he narrated. There was narration happening with this. And then the other one, we did the Charlotte Mason way, where he read only a chapter a week for 12 weeks. And he narrated. So we got to the end of the 12 weeks and I asked him about both books. And he barely remembered reading the first one that he had read too quickly. He could tell me all about the second one because he'd spent so much time with it. And you know, thinking about it every single week, the story just, it stuck in his mind and he had more time to think about it. And so then I realized, well, Charlotte Mason was right. We should slow down a little bit when we read our books. And that's just one way. So gradually over time, I have come to refine my way of understanding too. And I realize now some things that, you know, that Charlotte Mason said to do, or she did a certain way, it doesn't mean it's the only way. And she never thought it was the only way. It was just, this is a good implementation of this principle and this works. She knew that it worked. But just for example, I mean, they're just little things, you know, but like when you're studying an artist for picture study, you know, to have exactly 6 pictures or whatever, that wasn't that's not the most important thing. Where like every child has to study 3 foreign languages, you know, that's the Charlotte Mason thing. It's like, well, you don't have to do that. That's not what's really important about what we're doing here.
It's about the principles that are underlying things, not necessarily the specific way they're worked out.
Right. And when you have the principles and you know what they are, you can vary the practices with confidence because you know that you're sticking close to what really does matter.
When I spoke to Brandy Venzel in season 1 of this conversation series, that was something that really stuck out to me that she said, because I asked her, like, what happens when you have these ideals and these, you know, big ideas, and then you meet the nitty gritty of daily life? And she said, well, that's why they're principles. If you just have ideals, you know, you can tend to have like a checklist and it can become more like this burden. But when you have principles, then you're able to actually see the people and situations in your own home and apply those principles in wisdom and love. And that is, for her, what shows like why the principles are so good is because you can apply them in wisdom and love in your own unique situation. And that really stuck out to me.
Yeah, I absolutely. Brandy and I are on the same page when it comes to principles.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk to you about a quote that I just absolutely loved in your book, Consider This. So, you know, I obviously write at humilityanddoxology.com, and Humility and Doxology, though, is really more than just a website title for me. In fact, before I even started my site, I would tell my kids when we'd be talking about, you know, why are we educating? And I would use those terms with them. Those have really come to kind of define my whole like philosophy of education. And so let me read this quote that I just loved from your book. You
Okay.
said, "We do not list humility among our school subjects or put it on a transcript, but that is actually the little secret of classical education." So I wanted to ask if you could expand a little bit on that. Why do you think humility is so essential for education in general? And then what did you mean when you specifically related it to that little secret of classical education?
Well, you're right. For me, the idea of humility, when Charlotte Mason talks about humility, at one point she says, well, we don't really say too much about this, just like we don't expose the foundation of our house. But I say, you know what? We're going to have to, because we've gotten so far away from this idea. So humility, as it relates to education in general, I think is really, really important, because it's closely tied with the idea of wonder and the ability to see something and just realize that you're in the presence of some kind of knowledge or something amazing that you don't fully understand. And that place of not fully understanding is humility in a way. You have a sense of your own ignorance, your own lack, and out of that is born a desire, or should be born a desire, to know, to learn something new. So when you meet something, whether it's a new book or a new study or a new concept in science or something, if you realize, that you're in the presence of something amazing, like this is something really worth knowing, and I don't know it. Even if it's hard, there is somewhere inside of you just kind of a desire to get a hold of that thing, to understand that thing. So humility, I mean, it's not a false humility, the Uriah Heep kind of, I'm not. It's not about that. It's just about recognizing your own ignorance, which that's a strong word, but it's an important word, I think, because without it, if you don't realize that you have this lack, that you don't know something, and then you're in a position where you just, why are you going to take the time? Like, why are you going to be bothered? You're not interested in learning new things or trying to understand new things. It just puts a complete block. It just shuts down that position, of being able to learn. And learn in a way that is joyful, and learn in a way that, because you care, and not because somebody is like literally force feeding you some kind of information. So humility in that sense, and the thing about it is, the more your knowledge, the more you learn, the bigger your ignorance is going to grow. Because the more you learn and know, among all the other things that you learn and know is the fact that there are more things that you don't know. Like, there are huge gaps, and sometimes you just have to realize, you have to admit to yourself, you're never going to be able to fill in all these gaps. And that just, what is left except humility, to be able to accept that, I'm not going to know these things. I just can't know all these things. Some things are just beyond me. And that, again, is a part of that, the idea of, like, wow, like higher math, that is so amazing. And I'm just so impressed with people who really understand and grasp these concepts. And I'm in awe, but I'm never gonna fill in those gaps at this point. Those really higher level math. I've tried to read. I have a book. I always forget the title of it. It's just a thin little book, not very thick at all, and it's meant to be a literary explanation of Einstein's theory of relativity. And I have tried to read it. I never get past chapter 5. There's no math. It's meant for non-math people, but there's just something there. They get to a certain concept, and I'm just like, no, I cannot see this. Even though you put it in plain language, it's just, my mind just won't do it. So that's what, like I said, so for education in general, I think humility is extremely important, because that's the position from which you learn. Now, why I think it's the secret of classical education and is because it's like Socrates said, clear back to Greece. The ancient people that we think of or associate with classical education, we're not calling what they were doing classical education. It was just, they were just thinking about how people learn and how they would know. And that's what Socrates said. His biggest goal was to convince people of their own ignorance so that they could learn something. Because if they didn't understand that, then they weren't going to be able to learn. So going clear back to kind of what we think of as the beginning, Socrates and Plato, when we think about classical education in a historical way, that idea of humility is absolutely embedded. And every single time that educational practices have strayed away from that, and they've become about performance or, degrees, academic honors, academic status and prestige, we've lost the thing, that desire to know. The whole ivory tower concept, people who are just very, very self-satisfied within the boundaries that they've created, and they're just missing out on this continual growth and wonder that can only exist if you recognize your own ignorance, and you need to keep learning. So
yeah, how can we be teachable if we don't understand our place within the order of creation, right? Like, we are creatures and we're not the creator. If you lose sight of just who you are in the context of the universe, then that really just that displacement also displaces your ability to learn, to truly learn wisdom. Certainly you can learn a bunch of, I guess,
right.
facts, but you're not going to grow in wisdom.
And it's a danger. One of the reasons I took so much trouble to write about it is because there's a real danger with classical education for it to become a bit puffed up and a little bit proud about doing something that's so not mainstream and so, culturally significant. I mean, there's so many so many aspects of it. It's a risk. It's a real risk. So that's why I made humility, which I said is very closely tied to wonder. And if you read what people write about classical education, they always come back to wonder. And humility is just hand in glove with that, because that's what you're doing. You just, you stand there with that certain amount of awe and a recognition of your own smallness in the face of all that there is to know. So.
Yeah. And I guess that's why I'm thinking about wonder, that's then related to doxology, right? Because then our wonder turns to praise as we think of the source of all these wonderful things. So
yes, beautifully connected.
Well, let's talk for a minute to a mama maybe who is new to homeschooling or is new to ideas of Charlotte Mason education and is, trying to think, okay, I have all these ideas now. I want to try to apply them. Let's first think about a mom maybe who has all kind of younger children. What would you say are the most important things she needs to focus on, this year as she's starting out?
Right. Well, I think the one thing that a new homeschooler needs, and a mom of young children in particular, any mom, is to have patience with herself. Because homeschooling is a long job. It's you've got years and years and years, and every single year is going to be different. It creates what I'm seeing now. You want me to talk to young homeschool moms, which I will try to do. I'm presuming that's probably the bulk of your audience, right, is younger moms. But homeschool moms who've been doing this all the way through from start to finish have an educational experience that is practically unduplicated in the history of education. Because, if you're a teacher in a regular institutional setting, every single year you teach second grade maybe. So every single year you have a group of kids who are the exact same age, and you know exactly what they have to do in that year so you can prepare them to go on to third grade. And that's the only piece of education that you see. Or maybe, you're a high school English teacher. So every year, you're teaching 9th graders, 10th graders, 11th graders, and, a little piece of their overall high school experience, and that's all you ever see. Whereas a homeschool mom has got to start out with a kindergarten and take them all the way to high school graduation. I mean, you may do other things along the way, but that's the job. And that's what we do. And in doing that, year by year, you never repeat, like an institutional school teacher is, you never repeat the exact same experience. Because, this year I've got my first kid, we're doing kindergarten, we're doing first grade, and this is real. And oh my goodness, it's phonics. I've got to teach them how to read. And while you're trying to get your 6-year-old to sound out, consonant, vowel, consonant words, and just, struggling at that level, you can't even envision reading Anna Karenina with your high school. It's just like that. But maybe by the time that child is, in 6th grade, and they're reading all their home books for themselves, and they're not having any problem at all reading, maybe Animal Farm, or some book where they're really grappling with ideas, and you've got another 6-year-old and you're teaching them phonics, but it's so much easier. It's so much easier because okay, it's all right. Just, we'll get through this. And I taught her to read, so I'll be able to teach this one to read too. And so year by year, as a homeschool mom, your confidence is going to grow, and you're still going to have to keep learning because you're always going to be doing something new. Every year you have a different set, a different dynamic, different grades, the oldest, the youngest. This one's having trouble with math, all of a sudden that one's just, jumped ahead in reading, and the books you had planned are too easy for this year. These things happen. So homeschooling is such a long game that you need to not put too much pressure on yourself when you're first getting started to be like, okay, I've got some kind of results. I mean, you don't have to prepare your 2nd grader for 3rd grade next year that somebody else is going to do. You'll still be there. And if you only get halfway through the math book and you are still working on the same one next year, it's really okay. It's not there's nobody's going to come after you and tell you you're doing it wrong. And so I think a new homeschool mom needs to be patient with themselves. That it doesn't all have to be done this year. Every week doesn't have to be, you don't have to check every box every week. There is no behind, because you're not racing anybody else. You're just educating your own children. And in the same way, Charlotte Mason always makes the analogy of education and learning and connects it to food and feeding. And in the same way that you manage to keep your children fed, maybe this week they ate a lot of peanut butter jelly sandwiches, but nobody's dying of starvation, you will be able to keep teaching them, their academics as well. You're going to be feeding their hearts and souls with the books that you read and the songs that you sing and the art that you look at, and they will grow, and they will not intellectually die of starvation. And it's the natural thing that if you feed them, they will grow. So imagine if you put the pressure on yourself that your child's feet had to grow just so exactly much. And you weighed and measured all their food. And at the end of every week, you measured their feet, and you were, just stressed yourself out that they were not growing at the rate that you had sort of arbitrarily determined they should grow. I mean, that would be silly. And that would be silly. You're just going to keep feeding them, and guaranteed within 6 months, you're going to have to buy them new shoes because they'll have outgrown the old ones. And it's the same thing with feeding them, academically and intellectually. If you just keep reading books, consistently, working your way through phonics and math, reviewing what needs to review, going at the pace that they need to go at, you don't have to rush them. I mean, some kids are quick, and they'll be ready to move right along, and some kids need a little more time. And that's the beauty of homeschooling, is you can give them that time. You don't have, just the same way you wouldn't fret yourself, if your 6-year-old has smaller feet than her sister did at the same age. I mean, it doesn't matter. It's exactly the same when it comes to the academics and intellectual stuff. They will get to high school. They will, grow up to be functional adults. And so you don't have to put so much pressure on yourself while they're still young. The biggest gift that you can give yourself is to just be patient with yourself, and not to berate yourself if your kids aren't performing according to some arbitrary set of standards, just to feed them intellectually and spiritually the same way that you feed them physically, you know, reasonable amount at regular intervals, and it'll be fine. They'll grow.
I love that analogy because how many, times, especially if you've been a mom for a while, your kids, you think, wow, they just haven't gotten taller for like 6 months. And then all of a sudden they come downstairs in the morning and you're like, what happened to you last night? They just seem to go through this sudden growth spurt. And that's,
Right.
the same way with their intellectual growth as well. And if you lose sight of that big picture, you're just going to tie yourself up in knots.
Right. And that's the beauty of homeschooling and having this sort of long picture of education. There will be those, you plateau for a while, and then there'll be those growth spurts intellectually as well. And all of a sudden, the math that they were just, crying over is super easy and it's not a problem. And they're just, I've got this and it's not a problem. Or they're reading, you think most kids have this happen. They just go along and it's such a chore, and the reading is just, it's not even really reading, it's just decoding word by word. And then all of a sudden they can read, and they'll jump multiple years of reading levels within a very short period of time, just because the fluency was there and they were ready. And for some kids that happens at 6, and for some kids it happens at 10. It's just, it's there's nothing you can do to force it, just like you can't force your children to grow any faster than they're naturally going to grow.
I think that's one of the best parts of having now. So I have 5 children, and now working with that youngest child, the things I would stress so much about, oh no, they knew what sound B made yesterday and they can't remember today. And now I'm just like, one day the switch will flip and he'll get it, because
exactly.
every child has learned at a different time, and it was just unique to them. And there was nothing I could do to make it happen any faster.
And when you're first starting out with your first child, teaching them how to read, it feels like such a responsibility, and just like such a complex, if you just take it step by step and continue working on it, just the same way you can't stop feeding your kids. They'll suffer pretty quickly. You can't stop. You just have to keep going one step at a time, and not more than they can handle, just like you wouldn't overfeed them or force feed them, and the growth will happen when they're ready. And that, for me, as a I was the same way with my oldest. We started reading instruction bright and early, much too early. And so it took much longer than it really was necessary. And with your oldest, you feel all that pressure. And so as the next ones come along, it will be better. And you have lots and lots of years to work with.
Yes. Oh, that's a good reminder, even for me. Well, let's talk a little bit about, maybe a mom who has older children and either is going to be, transitioning from traditional school to homeschooling for the first time, or maybe she's been homeschooling, but she's thinking, wow, did I miss my chance? Is it too late to do Charlotte Mason education because I have these older kids and we've never narrated anything? And, is it ever too late? Or how do you transition to Charlotte Mason education kind of later on in the educational process?
Well, even though I've never done that myself, I have absolute confidence that it is doable and possible, because Charlotte Mason said it was, and she saw it happen. When during the years that Charlotte Mason was alive in England, in Victorian England, their educational system was kind of going through growing pains and some revolution. So like in the earlier years of her life, there was free education for like working class children only up to age 12. And then they extended that to 14. And then in 1915, early 20th century, they actually, there was something called the Fisher Act. And by then, working class children of 14 were working, like both boys and girls, like worked in factories, and they had jobs. And so with the Fisher Act, they provided 8 hours a week of free instruction to children, working children, from the ages of 14 to 18. So between 14 and 18, they were going to be entitled to 8 hours a week of free education. Now, there was a lot of talk about using those hours to basically give them vocational training. But Charlotte Mason, who by that time had a very successful correspondence program, and the PNEU was well established, and she had seen her methods and curriculum being used both in home schoolrooms and in schools, and she really made an effort to encourage the British public to give young people, starting at age 14, a liberal education, a literary education. So she thought that those children who would have had no previous experience narrating necessarily, they could have gone to school anywhere, could come in at that point and do the work of, I can't remember if I think she was thinking like Form 4 work, basically high school work, from her already established correspondence school. And they wouldn't necessarily be able to do the full program in just 8 hours a week, but they could do the literary part of it. They could do the reading part of it. They wouldn't necessarily have time to do all the math or the foreign language study, but they could read these books, and she just felt like it would be so good for them to think, experience in speaking, which was to be able to speak in public was very, very important to them, and to be able to communicate well. And so she thought they could come right in at 14 and start doing those readings and start doing that narrating. And so I really think that idea is rooted in her basic belief that children are born persons, and high schoolers are persons too. It's not just babies that are born persons.
You mean teens are persons too?
That's right. Teenagers are persons too. And they have the same basic hunger for knowledge, and you are respecting their minds by giving them, appropriate material for them to read. And they are people, so communication is kind of a natural thing that we do. So why not narrate? That's all it is a kind of communication. So there's nothing wrong with starting at that point. And honestly, like, if you start with a 6-year-old, it could take them a good 3 to 4 years to become a really good, solid, fluent narrator. A high schooler is going to start at the same, like, this is really hard, I can't do this, but they're going to actually come up to speed a lot faster. They're very quickly going to catch on, and their attention span is just naturally going to be stronger at that age, so that they're going to be able to narrate fluently within, maybe 6 to 8 weeks, where it takes longer when they're young. So it's perfectly possible to go ahead and do it. The one thing I would say about it, though, I think, this is my opinion, for that age, you really need the child to be on your side. They need to understand why they're doing it. Like something like narration, it's different from what they might have done before. And it feels a little bit awkward and unnatural, especially if you've read something aloud. But at that age, they're probably going to be reading most of their books themselves, to just tell it back without any, questions to answer or fill in the blank or that sort of thing. It feels a little strange and awkward. So you really need them to be on your side. They need to understand why narration is a valuable thing to do, and what it will do for them if they develop that skill. That's my only caveat. It's absolutely doable, but it will be a whole lot easier if you enlist their will in what you're doing with narration in particular.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. We do like reading. My older kids do their reading journals, which is essentially written narration of what they're reading. We don't call it that, but that's essentially what it is.
Right.
But we've built that up over years. It would definitely, if I just one day popped in and was like, and this week I expect 5 reading journal pages, out of the blue, I could imagine that not going over very well.
Right. No, right. So, and you can start if you start with older children, you can go ahead and start them slow. You don't have to start them, with lengthy written narrations or anything. Go ahead and start with oral narration. That's really the best starting place, even at that age. And then you'll be able to bring writing into it in a relatively short amount of time.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you here at the close the two questions I'm asking all my guests this fall. So the first question is just, what are you reading lately?
Okay, well, like everybody else, I have read a ton of escapist reading over the last few months, right? So,
Yes.
I mean, I can't even remember it all. I just, when it's just, I've spent hours just devouring escapist literature, doing some rereading of old favorites, um, and I have a very, very eclectic taste from, young adult post-apocalyptic to, something like Divergent or The Hunger Games to, oh, should I admit this?
Yes, you should.
Like the occasional, Stephen King or something like that.
Yeah.
A sort of psychological thriller. There's a few genres I don't do, but Georgette Heyer every now and then.
Oh, I love Georgette
You
Heyer.
know,
Yes.
but I'm talking escapist stuff here, just
Uh-huh.
unrealistic, whatever, just predictable. So I've read a lot of that, but I'm also reading some other, a few other things. I always have way more books on the go than I get through. Like it takes forever to finish it because I'm always starting something new. But I've really been delving a lot into grammar and logic and language. Socratic Logic by Peter Kreeft. And that's just been absolutely fascinating. And that's sent me off, exploring grammar. And I've just had all these grammar thoughts going through my head. So I've been doing a lot of reading, like I said, about like a language and linguistics and logic. And I'm also reading, what have I got? My stack over there. I'm in the middle of The Discarded Image by C.S. Lewis.
Love that one.
Yeah, I'm taking that one really, really slowly. And I've always got a Charlotte Mason. I just did a deep dive into home education as well. And so now I'm working on parents and children. I'm always reading in her volumes.
I love to see sometimes you'll write on your website too. Some new thing that you've just learned is like no matter how many times you read it, you're always
It happens. It never fails. I read a Charlotte Mason book and I learn something new every single time. And I've long since lost count of how many times I've read them. So.
Well, I appreciate you too, admitting the escapist literature because
I realized I did that. I was talking to somebody on a podcast once and I said something and they're like, "Oh, I'm glad to know you don't just read, C.S. Lewis." It's like, yeah, no. I don't want people to have that impression about me at all.
Yeah, I don't like kind of a literary idea where we all have to be pretentious and hide the fact that, I have this great big stack of really fancy books, but really I just keep going back to Agatha Christie this month,
Exactly.
We just need that too. That's important.
I said to somebody just recently, I would love to meet an Agatha Christie that I hadn't read, like to have that experience. Because I read them all long ago. And I just sort of jokingly said, nobody tells us voracious readers that we might want to save something for later.
That's right. That's the problem with loving dead authors. Like there's never a new book at the library.
Right.
Terrible.
So, yeah.
Well,
and
but
one of my favorite things to read are Victorian novels. I absolutely literature. But I've been reading it since I was 19. So I'm on the C list. I haven't read a good one in ages.
I really enjoyed Wilkie Collins. That was Victorian, right?
Oh, Wilkie Collins.
Yeah.
Did you say you did enjoy him?
No, yes, I did. I could never figure out why people liked Dickens instead of Wilkie Collins. I was like, I love Wilkie Collins so much more.
Well, Wilkie Collins is fantastic, and I've read tons and tons of his books. They all follow the same basic plot. Things are bad, things get worse, then worse, and then much, much worse, and then yet still worse. And when you can hardly believe it, they get even worse than that. And in the last chapter, do ex machina, something comes along and sets it all right.
It sounds like a perfect book for 2020. We need that hope. There's going to be an end chapter.
Every single one. That's it. We need the
hope of a final happy ending.
I hadn't thought of that 2020 as a Wilkie Collins novel.
Well, finally here, Karen, we talked a little bit about this earlier, but one thing I'm just asking everyone here is, if you were talking to a new homeschool parent, what's sort of the one thing you would want to say to them?
Well, like I said, you want to have patience with yourself. And I think the other thing that I would say is enjoy the ride. It's not, yes, sometimes it's a little tedious and a burden and a chore, but in reality, I mean, you're engaged in what is one of the most fascinating jobs on the planet, like helping a human being develop. And so, enjoy it, take the time to notice, their delight in figuring out something new, or, doing a hard math problem, or getting reading a whole page for the first time. Just enjoy it, because it's a real blessing, and you may not even realize it until it's more in the past than now. So try, if you can, in the midst of all of the, got to get math done, change the diaper, sort the laundry, get dinner started, try to enjoy this kind of amazing thing that we get to do as homeschool moms.
Oh, I love that. Thank you for that good reminder. Well, Karen, where can people find you all around the internet?
Well, I have a website. It's karenglass.net. So karenglass.net is my basic homepage. The most interesting thing there is probably my blog, in my opinion. It's the only thing I'm not really great at keeping it up to date, except that I do blog on a semi, occasional basis. We'll put it that way. I figured out my blogging style a long time ago, and it's not weekly, throwback Thursday, Monday this, every Friday. That's not my style. But so there's a really, I started that blog in 2014. And so at this point, it's got quite a lot of content there about Charlotte Mason, about classical education, and all kinds of random miscellaneous stuff as well. So I also have a Facebook page, Karen Glass Author, and I have Instagram account at Karen Glass Reads. So
perfect. And I'll have all of that linked up in the show notes for this episode at humilityanddoxology.com. Thank you, Karen, so much for chatting with us today.
Well, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed that. I haven't done a face-to-face interview like this in a long time, and it was a lot of fun. And it was nice to meet you, Ian.
It was nice to meet you too.